Underneath their assumptions, behind the scaffolding of their strategies, you quietly rearranged the board. Not by rushing, not by flinching, but by existing in a different frequency entirely. They watched the surface, the optics, the reactions, the gestures. You stayed beneath it all. And when the time came, when the pressure rose and the stakes aligned, you made the move they never imagined, because it was never in their script. Their scripts were built on patterns they could predict, responses they could provoke. What you did shattered the illusion of their control. You chose the path that redefined the outcome. Not through retaliation, but through reinvention. You didn't just play the game differently, you made it irrelevant. The lethal move wasn't violence. It wasn't confrontation. It was the decision to disengage from their theater entirely. You didn't step onto their stage. You built a new venue where their applause meant nothing. That's what gutted them. Not that you won, but that you stopped trying to be seen by them. You outgrew their metrics. While they obsessed over reaction, you prioritized evolution. They baited you with insults, mockery, neglect, anything to pull you back into familiar territory. But instead of falling for the trap, you disappeared into mastery. You made growth your vengeance. You became so unrecognizable that by the time they tried to recalibrate, you were gone, untouchable, rewritten. They'd studied your old moves, memorized your weaknesses, timed your outbursts, built entire strategies on your past, but your silence broke their rhythm. Your shift made their scripts obsolete. And the most unsettling part, you didn't warn them. No speech, no clues. Just one day, they looked up, and you weren't standing where you used to be. You weren't pleading, explaining, justifying. You were building, moving, creating in dimensions they'd never even visited. And when they tried to follow, their tools failed them. Because this wasn't about intelligence anymore. This was about capacity, depth, endurance. They played short-term games with someone built for legacy. Your power wasn't noise, it was nuance. The lethal move didn't detonate, it simmered. It brewed slowly inside your discipline, inside your refusal to be rushed, inside your decision to speak only when the silence had done enough damage. You didn't scream for justice. You became the evidence. And when the world finally noticed, when the audience turned, they realized the person they once dismissed had become the architect of an outcome no one else could even see. You didn't seek revenge. You became the reminder, the living artifact of what happens when someone stops trying to win the game and rewrites the rules by evolving beyond recognition. They underestimated what happens when someone stops caring about credit, stops needing validation, stops performing for applause. That's when the game becomes lethal, because then you're not anchored by ego. You're not slowed by self-doubt. You move clean, strategic, unapologetic. That's what threw them. Not just the move itself, but the calm with which it was made, the certainty, the absence of rage. Rage is predictable. They had prepared for that, but grace paired with precision. That was alien. And as they scrambled to respond, to regain footing, to reclaim the narrative, they felt the gravity shift. Because now, they were reacting. And you were dictating tempo without speaking. There's something unspeakably terrifying about being exposed by someone who doesn't gloat, who simply acts and vanishes, leaving only the impact behind. You became that figure, not a villain, not a hero, a force, a presence. And forces don't apologize. They alter reality, they bend outcomes. You weren't trying to be feared. But fear arrived anyway, because people fear what they can't predict. And you made yourself untraceable. The most lethal move wasn't about dominance, it was about transcendence. You showed them that power isn't control, it's release. Letting go of the need to win and focusing instead on becoming undeniable. You were never loud. But your absence roared, you didn't beg, you simply walked. And in walking, you pulled the curtain on their performance. The moment you stopped playing along, the magic trick collapsed. You were the anchor, the credibility, the thing they leaned on while pretending you didn't matter. And when you left, the room felt hollow. That was your move. To become so essential in silence that your exit caused the architecture to quake. Now they analyze your disappearance like a crime scene, trying to understand what they missed. But they missed everything. Because they were looking at you, not through you. The psychology of your move was what left them shaken. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't reaction, it was art. A symphony composed over years of being dismissed, underestimated, overlooked. You let them get comfortable. You let them write you off. And then you inverted the whole dynamic. The play became the player. And the silence, that was the applause. Not from them, but from the universe. From every unseen layer of your journey that bore witness to your restraint, your patience, your evolution. They will never admit it, but they know now. You could have destroyed them. But instead, you rebuilt yourself. And that choice, the one they didn't see coming, is what still haunts them. They speak your name differently now. Hesitant, curious, as if it carries weight they hadn't prepared to hold. Because now they know. You were never trying to win the game. You were trying to understand it, to see how deep it went. And once you did, you stepped beyond it. While they argued over pieces, you redesigned the board. And that shift, that quiet, seismic pivot, is irreversible. They'll spend years recovering from the realization that they never knew who you really were. Because the version they planned for, the one they thought was easy to predict, is gone. Replaced by someone forged in silence and crowned in clarity. Their game had volume, yours had vibration. They sought applause from the balcony seats, while you listened to whispers buried beneath bloodlines. They moved in public forums, shouting, parading, scrambling for relevance, while you walked in the shadows of your ancestors, collecting silence like sacred knowledge. Their strategies were loud, time-stamped, algorithm-fed, yours ancient. Rooted in rituals passed down through generations who didn't write things down because survival had no need for paper. You weren't simply playing to win. You were aligning with something older than them, deeper than them, more precise than their entire lineage of borrowed tricks. They kept pressing their keys hoping for a response. What they got was reverberation, spiritual consequence. You didn't act, you invoked. And they never had the spiritual armor to recognize it, let alone survive it. They thought the battlefield was social media, that reputations rose and fell on retweets and trends. But your arena had no cameras. Your audience were the ghosts behind your eyes, the memory of those who suffered before you, watching to see if you'd flinch or repeat history. Your silence wasn't passivity, it was code. Protection. A layered encryption only the spiritually attuned could begin to decipher. While they were rehearsing their image, you were performing surgery, cutting trauma at its root, refining your essence behind closed doors. Their brand was built on exposure, yours on extraction. You extracted patterns from pain, prophecy from silence. And when you finally moved, they felt it before they saw it. That's the difference between spiritual warfare and social maneuvering. One leaves bruises, the other leaves bloodlines changed. They operated with borrowed tools. You carried ancestral blades, sharpened not by ego but by grief, justice, and divine timing. Every step you took was calculated through intuition trained in fire. They underestimated that, mistook your quiet as hesitation, laughed at your refusal to compete publicly. But you were never in their game. You were in ritual, in alignment. In communion with forces they mocked until they watched outcomes shift without logical explanation. They had PR, you had prophecy. And when it collided, their infrastructure collapsed under the weight of consequences they didn't believe in. Your move was spiritual, but your execution was surgical, precise, clean, irreparable. The kind of move that left no need for explanation, just aftermath. They thought dominance came through visibility. But you learned early that real power is often invisible, that the loudest one in the room is usually the most afraid. They needed spectators to validate their moves. You needed no one, because your guidance came from sources they couldn't hear. You saw the layers behind their strategies, the unspoken desperation, the fear inside their aggression. And so you didn't meet them head on. You maneuvered through frequency. Your intuition became your weapon. And while they launched campaign after campaign, you sat back, letting timing punish arrogance better than words ever could. Their strategy was theater. Yours was reality. And reality always wins. The spiritual nature of your game made it immune to sabotage. They tried to slander you, but their words fell dead in rooms you no longer occupied. They tried to bait you into conflict, but you had already disengaged from ego. They wanted chaos. You cultivated clarity. They assumed your calm was weakness, when in fact it was calibration. You were tuning yourself to something they couldn't hear, and when it aligned, when your timing hit that sacred frequency, they watched everything shift without understanding why. That's the part they can't forgive. That you didn't just win, you transcended. And in doing so, you forced them to realize how spiritually bankrupt their strategies were. They operated on impulse. You operated on insight. They strategized with advisors. You meditated with memory. Every move you made was backed by 1,000 unspoken sacrifices, by prayers whispered in rooms where you weren't even supposed to survive. That's why your victory tasted different. It wasn't conquest, it was confirmation. The universe echoed your decision. The ancestors nodded. Your spirit felt lighter, because you didn't beat them with spite. You surpassed them with soul. They were focused on optics. You were focused on alignment. And when alignment came, the precision of your strike couldn't be countered. Not because it was brutal, but because it was destined. Their confusion is their punishment. They're still trying to decode how you did it. They thought they were dealing with a competitor. They didn't know they were up against a current, a frequency, a force calibrated by silence and sharpened by suffering. You had been listening while they were performing. You had been healing while they were scheming. So when it came time to move, your action felt unnatural to them. Too clean, too inevitable. And that's what made it lethal. It wasn't just that you won. It was that you made their existence in the game irrelevant. They screamed louder. You disappeared deeper. They spiraled. You soared. And what truly destroyed them was the simplicity. No speeches, no public statements. Just a clean, almost surgical exit from their narratives. They had no idea you had already left the building mentally, spiritually, emotionally. They kept reacting to a version of you that no longer existed, like trying to fight a shadow on the wall while the light source has already moved. Your growth outpaced their tactics. And now they look like children playing checkers with someone who stopped playing altogether. You're no longer on the board. You've become the architect of the board itself. They can't win because they're still using rules you've already rewritten. You played your game like an ancestral ritual. You weren't just responding to opponents. You were breaking generational cycles. While they scrambled for dominance, you were liberating bloodlines. That's what they'll never understand. To them, it was a win or lose scenario. To you, it was redemption, healing, transmutation. They were clapping for themselves while you were communing with forces that have no need for applause. And when the results came, when your move unfolded like prophecy, clean, unstoppable, sacred, they called it luck. But deep down, in the silence they avoid, they know they were touched by something they couldn't fight, something they still don't have a name for. They prepared for your eruption like children anticipating thunder. They wanted the spectacle. Their entire strategy was built on the assumption that you'd scream, react, lash out, spill your fury in the town square where they could point and call it proof. They trained for chaos because chaos they could narrate. They stocked up on rebuttals, practiced their innocence in front of mirrors, and whispered rehearsed concern to those gullible enough to lend them ears. Their theater depended on you being loud. It hinged on your name being dragged into noise you never co-signed. They wanted a fire they could call dangerous, one they could gather around and condemn. What they never anticipated was the silence, the cruel, unbroken, surgical silence that gutted them deeper than any scream ever could. You gave them nothing, and that's what shattered them. You didn't flinch. You didn't type. You didn't defend. You vanished like a ghost with unfinished business, not in weakness, but in mastery, because you understood something they never will. Absence is not void. Absence is volume inverted. It's pressure. It's presence without performance. And when you made that move, when you chose not to play, it rewired the entire arena. They felt that absence not as relief but as punishment, because silence leaves people with themselves. And when all their projections echoed back unanswered, when their lies hung in the air with no target to pierce, they started suffocating on their own narratives. You never touched them, but they still collapsed. That's the horror of absence. It's a mirror they can't smash. And now they sit there, drenched in their own noise, trying to decipher the power of someone who didn't even stay to witness their implosion. They miscalculated your evolution, believed their provocation would pull out the old version of you. The reactive one, the raw one, the one who bled too fast and explained too much. But that version was gone, buried beneath layers of discipline, spiritual clarity, and brutal self-honesty. You didn't grow louder. You grew quieter, and in doing so, you weaponized your evolution. Because noise is an addiction, and they were banking on you feeding it. When you didn't, they panicked, started talking louder, started twisting harder. But without your energy in the mix, the entire equation broke down. You were no longer playing the role they cast you in. And that frightened them more than any retaliation ever could. Their eyes widened the longer your silence stretched. They started revisiting old conversations, reading texts, replaying the tone of your last goodbye. They began questioning the smirk on your face the final time they tried to trigger you. Was that the moment you decided to vanish? Was that silence the beginning of the end? They don't know, and that unknowing corrodes them, because they can't fix what they can't find. You left no residue, no trail. Just a black hole where your presence used to be. A clean, cold void that echoes their guilt, their manipulation, their cowardice. You didn't retaliate, you let time do the carving. And now they're living in the sculpture of their own undoing. You were never built for volume. You were built for velocity, precision, timing. While they ran simulations on your rage, you were mastering your restraint. While they plotted headlines, you were learning how to ghost people mid-sentence. How to let your absence say everything your voice once tried to explain. That's the kind of shift they can't comprehend, because they only understand noise. But you came from environments where silence was sacred, where every still moment was a warning, every quiet breath a signal. They don't know how to interpret that language, and they never will, because you didn't just change your behavior, you changed your language. And now you're speaking in a frequency they can't access. They kept poking the cage, not realizing you'd already slipped out. By the time they noticed the stillness, you were no longer a participant. You were the observer. You watched them scramble to interpret the vacuum you left behind. Watched them spiral, desperately trying to control a narrative they could no longer tether to you. That's the thing about absence. It becomes a canvas for projection. And every time they speak now, they reveal more about themselves than they do about you. You forced their hand without moving yours, made them betray their own intentions just by refusing to show up. And that's how you win without being seen. Their desperation mutated, first into arrogance, then into confusion, and finally into quiet fear. Because silence makes space for truth to whisper. It allows perception to settle. Without your reactions muddying the water, people started seeing the pattern for what it was. The manipulation, the baiting, the rehearsed innocence. You didn't expose them directly. You created conditions for revelation. And now they're exposed, not by you, but by their own behavior in your absence. The eyes of others shifted. The energy around them changed. They lost the spotlight not because you fought them for it, but because you made it irrelevant. When you left, you took the gravity with you, and now they orbit nothing. You knew what they never would. Sometimes the most savage punishment is no punishment at all. No vengeance, no speech. Just a disappearing act so complete, so disciplined, it rewrites the room. You didn't let them have the satisfaction of conflict. You denied them the joy of the fight, and that denial, it crushed them. Because conflict was their only language. And you refused to speak it. They still sit with that silence, still try to decode it. They don't realize the game ended the moment you walked away. You didn't drop the mic. You turned off the sound system. And now, their voices echo in a void where your presence once lived. Absence demands power. It takes restraint to say nothing while the world tries to narrate you. But you mastered it. You let them say what they needed to. Let them smear and scramble and spit. Because you knew none of it would matter. Not when the truth arrives slowly, like water eating through stone. You trusted the psychology of quiet. Understood that absence removes the distraction of your defense, allowing people to observe the real aggressor. And now those who once doubted you feel the shift. Not because you argued your case, but because you left them with the evidence and walked away. The verdict was never spoken, it was felt. But when tension rose, when truth neared the surface, they shrank into sarcasm, distractions, and sudden disappearances. They feared being exposed. They feared the kind of conversation that tears down facades. And you didn't chase the argument. You didn't demand the mic. You studied silence until it bent to your will. You cultivated a presence that didn't need confrontation to dominate, because true influence doesn't announce itself. It rearranges expectations through posture, tone, and timing. And while they sidestepped discomfort, you mastered the art of controlled pressure. You started to speak in ways they couldn't counter. Not louder, just clearer. You didn't flood conversations. You dropped statements like seeds, words so precise. They kept growing in their minds long after the exchange ended. You didn't need to prove you were right. You allowed them to collapse under the weight of what they refused to face. That's influence. It isn't about argument. It's about shifting the atmosphere so thoroughly that even silence feels like exposure. You didn't attack. You revealed. And in doing so, you became the one thing they feared more than confrontation, a mirror that never blinked. They feared intensity because it forces revelation. You mastered presence so disciplined. They couldn't hide behind their usual tactics. Every time you entered the space, their energy shifted. Not because you threatened, because you saw. You saw through the smile the subtext, the curated narrative. You asked questions that didn't need answers. You spoke truths dressed in calm, and it rattled them more than rage ever could. You made it impossible for them to control the temperature of a room, because your calm burned hotter than their chaos. An influence like that, it exposes fear without ever raising its voice. They were used to dominating through performance. They told stories to control perception. They relied on reputations that kept people guessing. But you didn't guess. You observed. You didn't react. You recalibrated. They feared confrontation because they feared being misunderstood. You stopped needing to be understood. You simply made it impossible to be ignored. While they debated optics, you studied leverage. You learned how to shift a decision with a single look, how to redirect tension with a pause. You weren't interested in winning arguments. You were reprogramming how the conversation unfolded from the moment you walked in. You became fluent in reading discomfort, and discomfort tells no lies. You watched how they avoided eye contact when truth edged near, how their tone sharpened when control slipped, how they changed subjects the moment questions carried weight, and you did nothing to stop them. That was your influence. You didn't interrupt their avoidance. You let it echo. You gave their weakness the space to expose itself. You knew that real confrontation doesn't always require conflict. Sometimes, it only needs contrast between someone who runs and someone who stands completely still. They feared confrontation because it makes false power brittle. You didn't destroy them. You let their need to avoid discomfort hollow them out. You became someone who could sit in any tension without blinking. Someone who didn't fear silence, who didn't shrink under misinterpretation, who didn't adjust their truth just to avoid offense. And that presence, it dismantled the very foundation of their authority. Because once people realize who really controls the emotional tone of a space, they stop looking to noise for leadership. They look to the one who can stay composed when the air thickens. And you were always composed. They trained themselves to be liked. You trained yourself to be respected. They feared pushback. You studied pressure. And when it came time to speak, you didn't bark. You aimed. Your words landed not because they were louder, but because they came from alignment. You no longer reacted to provocations. You outgrew them. That evolution scared them. Because when someone doesn't fear confrontation, doesn't flinch at conflict, doesn't chase closure, they become unpredictable. And unpredictable people can't be manipulated. You stopped being manageable. And in their world, that meant you became dangerous. They still try to provoke you, hoping to pull you back into the old dynamic. They want the emotional version of you, the one who explained, defended, justified. But you replace that version with someone who understands that the greatest authority you'll ever have is over your own nervous system. They shout. You blink slowly. They accuse. You raise an eyebrow. They overreact. You understate. You shifted the battlefield. You stopped showing up where the fight is loudest. You began shaping outcomes before they knew the game had started. That's what broke them. You weren't avoiding the confrontation. You had mastered the entire environment.